Jon Snow stood upon the ramparts of Winterfell, his fur cloak clasped tight around his broad shoulders as a biting wind swept across the battlements. The sky was as pale as bone, and the north had sunk deep into the throes of winter. He gazed out over the snow-shrouded courtyard below, where a few hardy men practiced with blunted swords under the watchful eye of the master-at-arms. He felt the familiar ache of responsibility press upon his chest. The newly declared king in the north had grown accustomed to the weight of crowns and titles, though he wore them far less easily than the black cloak of the Night's Watch. He could almost feel the presence of those who had come before him. Eddard Stark, Robb Stark, his ancestors long turned to dust, watching him from the stones of this ancient fortress, judging whether he was worthy. He often doubted his own claim, even if his bannermen did not. He, a bastard, was now expected to defend the north against threats from within and without, and the greatest threat of all from beyond the wall. But cunning and alliances were needed as much as steel and honor. Though many northern lords bristled at southern entanglements, Jon understood that wars were not won by strength of arms alone. He closed his eyes against a gust of wind. When Sansa had first broached the idea of seeking southern alliances, he had been torn. Her counsel was wise. She was not the naive girl who had once dreamed of heroes and golden knights. She had seen the cruelties of the South for herself. Yet her experiences had also taught her that the North could not stand entirely alone. They needed provisions, supplies, and the promise of cavalry and ships if the realm was to be secured against both Lannister ambitions and the encroaching doom of the others. Even more than that, they needed friends beyond the neck. Jon simply did not anticipate that the best opportunity might come from so far south. Tyen Sand's arrival in the north had been whispered of before she ever set foot on the King's Road. The idea was the brainchild of Petyr Baelish, or so rumor held, for Petyr was said to have influence with those in Dorne who wanted new allies to challenge the power in King's Landing. Yet Sansa had insisted it might also be the Prince of Dorne's desire. No, not Prince Doran himself, but the new powers that had risen in the wake of Oberyn Martell's death, and later the fiasco surrounding Princess Myrcella. Dorne had always sought an upper hand against House Lannister. If forging a bond with a newly crowned king in the north could give them leverage, they might well seize it. Still, the plan sounded near unthinkable to many. What had the north ever to do with Dorne? The northern lords remembered the Red Mountains only as a place of parched deserts and proud, fiery people, so far removed from their snow and ice. Dorne was rumored to be a land of poisoners and paramours, of secret plots, hidden daggers, and vendettas carried across generations. To many in the north, the Dornish were strangers twice over. But the repeated letters from Dorne, accompanied by the elegant handwriting that claimed to be from Tyen Sand herself, had arrived nonetheless. She was no lady in the conventional sense, a bastard of Oberyn Martell, known as one of the Sand Snakes, but she was connected by blood to House Martell. Tyrion Lannister had once said, "In Dorne, bastardy is no great stigma. They recognized the children of their princes, crowned or not, with courtesy and sometimes even titles of their own." Jon had summoned a meeting of his principal bannermen to discuss the offer. Almost every one of them came in defiance or grudging loyalty. Though they had raised him on their shields as king in the north, they still tested him, still waited to see whether he could live up to their expectations. The great hall of Winterfell was lit with tall, flickering torches, the gloom banished by warm orange light. Sansa stood behind Jon's seat, a silent pillar of support, though she had offered him her counsel in private before. Davos Seaworth sat near, observing everyone, wise and weathered, the quiet voice of reason. The northern lords broke into murmurs when Jon announced a potential alliance with Dorne. The plump Lord Glover shook his head. Lady Mormont, bold as ever, demanded to know if the Dornish had proven loyal in past wars. They remembered how Dorne had often stood apart from the conflicts that raged across the Seven Kingdoms. Only after considerable debate and an assurance that they would take no action without further parley did the lords grudgingly accept that at least they should hear Tyen Sand's proposition. So letters continued to pass between Winterfell and the southernmost kingdom. Tyen Sand's words were measured, respectful, but also laced with a confidence that intrigued Jon. She wrote of how Dorne, cast aside and dismissed by the Iron Throne, was eager to find new paths of influence. The Martells harbored a bitter hatred for House Lannister, given how Elia Martell had died, how Oberyn Martell had fallen, and the humiliations that came after. Tyene wrote in a careful, diplomatic voice, "I come to beg peace and offer alliance in place of old animosities. My father believed in the strength of shared causes. We of Dorne might be far in distance, but we do not forget insults or friendships, if such can be forged across mountains and deserts." Time flowed like winter's breath across the courtyard. Jon found his mind increasingly drawn to the possibility of forging a link with Dorne. With the White Walkers looming beyond the wall, what sense did it make to fight more petty wars in the south? The King's Landing regime was in chaos with the demise of key figures, the rise of the Iron Throne under those few left in power. If an alliance could be made, if armies and resources could be united, perhaps the realm could stand a better chance. But how? The answer took shape in rumor before it was ever voiced aloud: marriage. Uniting the houses through marriage was the oldest trick in the realm. A wedding between Jon Snow, the newly declared king in the north, and Tyen Sand, the fiery daughter of Oberyn Martell, might well create a formal bond. If Dorne pledged men and gold, if the North pledged loyalty to defend Dorne from Lannister reprisals, they could stand together. The notion bristled the beards of many a northern lord, who saw it as surrendering their proud autonomy to a region of poisoners. But Sansa, Davos, and others who had lived among the intrigues of the South understood the power such a union might wield. Time stretched on. The day came when a long column of Dornish riders approached the gates of Winterfell, their banners fluttering with the burning sun of House Martell. Snow churned beneath the hooves of southern-bred horses, and more than one rider looked ill at ease with the bitter cold. But at their head, swathed in thick furs, rode Tyen Sand. She was not accompanied by an army, only a modest retinue, enough to ensure her safety. Jon and his household assembled in the courtyard to greet her. She dismounted with practiced grace, a swirl of dark curls peeking out from beneath her hood. Her skin was sun-kissed, a stark contrast to the pallor of the Northmen. Her eyes, an even mixture of warmth and watchfulness, locked upon Jon from the moment she set foot on northern soil. She moved across the snow with the quiet confidence of a woman who knew her worth. The courtesy was observed. Sansa curtsied in her northern manner, Davos offered a polite bow, and Jon inclined his head. "Welcome to Winterfell," Jon said. His voice, though calm, carried in it the tension of one unaccustomed to pleasantries. He stood a step taller than her, though she was not short. "Your journey must have been difficult in these conditions." Tyene lifted her chin. Her accent lilted in a softer version of Oberyn's, though she spoke with the crisp clarity of one well-educated. "The cold is unforgiving, but I thank you for your hospitality, your grace." She paused, letting the title linger, and Jon felt the eyes of his bannermen. He had never been wholly comfortable being called a king, yet she seemed to say it without mockery. They guided her inside, through the great double doors of Winterfell. The warmth of the hall enveloped them like a welcoming cloak compared to the frigid courtyard. There, servants hurried to bring mulled wine and hot cider. Those lords brave enough to greet a Dornish envoy gathered around, eyeing her with open curiosity. Tyene's retinue, several desert-born guards and a couple of ladies from Dorne, took their place to one side. At the high table, Jon presented her to the northern nobility. Lady Lyanna Mormont offered a stiff courtesy. Lord Glover bowed so shallowly it could scarcely be called a bow. The rest mirrored him. Dinner was served. Roasted boar, hot stews, black bread fresh from the ovens. Tyene ate politely, occasionally giving an appreciative murmur for the seasoning, which was decidedly lacking compared to Dornish fare. The conversation remained guarded. Sansa, with her knowledge of southern courtesies, steered the talk toward small pleasantries first. Tyene, for her part, was adept at praising the north where she could. Its proud people, the stark majesty of its landscapes, the discipline she had seen in the courtyard. Jon took note of how she deftly avoided pitfalls, speaking little of the political tension in King's Landing, or the fate of Myrcella Baratheon. When at last the great hall emptied, and only close confidants remained, they spoke more plainly. Tyene asked after the loyalty of the northern houses, noting rumors from King's Landing that the north was divided. Jon admitted that unity was hard-won, but reaffirmed the north stood behind him to guard its independence. Tyene shared glimpses of the situation in Dorne, how the old prince's health had failed and the next in line was cunning enough to see that alliance with the north might serve their mutual ends. "The Lannisters are weakened," she observed, "but they are not without claws. If we strike them alone, we risk their retribution. If we ally with others, we stand a chance of breaking their hold over the Iron Throne." Davos studied her with the shrewd gaze of an old smuggler. He listened to every word, glancing occasionally at Jon, as if to gauge how the king was receiving her proposals. Sansa asked pointed questions, referencing the vows that Dorne might be willing to make, the precise terms of their agreement. There was no avoiding the heart of the matter. Tyene folded her hands in her lap and stared at the small gathering with a level of poise that seemed beyond her years. "It is the wish of those who govern Dorne," she said, "to unite with the North in alliance. Marriage has often sealed such bonds. If the king in the North is willing, I would gladly consent to be that bridge." She spoke the words plainly, neither simpering nor feigning humility. Jon could respect that. She did not quiver like a lady forced into a match she dreaded. If she was reluctant, she hid it well. Or perhaps, he thought, she truly believed in the necessity of this union. He shifted in his seat, aware of every eye upon him, from Davos to Sansa to the lords who lingered in the shadows. "You understand what that entails," Jon said. "The North can be unforgiving." He repeated her own word. "Our ways are not soft. The cold is not the only hardship." Tyene's lips curved, half amusement, half challenge. "Dorne, too, can be harsh," she said. "The heat of our sun is fiercer than your winter's chill in its own way. I have learned to endure. I have learned to fight. I may not be a proper lady in the eyes of the South, but I bring the will of my people." Jon inclined his head. He could not help but notice that there was a different light in her eyes now, perhaps reflecting the torchlight, or perhaps something in her spirit. An echo of Oberyn's famed charisma. If she was anything like her father, she would be both dangerous and compelling. They parted that night with the matter still unresolved. The council had to be convinced, but the next weeks saw more dinners, more discussions, more private negotiations. Tyene did not hide from the courtiers. She toured the courtyard, conversed with the stable hands, marveled at the crypts of Winterfell with only a couple of her ladies for company. She spent time with Sansa, discussing the finer points of governance in the north, provisions for winter, how the harvests from the south might supplement the meager stores in the next few months. She spoke with Davos late into the evening over cups of mulled wine, gleaning every bit of knowledge about how the north had survived crises in the past. Some nights, she even joined the watchers upon the ramparts, her cloak wrapped tight as she gazed at the swirling snowfall, the starry night sky so alien to a child of the southern deserts. Jon found himself alternating between formal meetings and occasional moments of accidental intimacy. Once, he passed by the library to find Tyene seated by the fire, reading from one of the tomes on the history of the North. She glanced up, closed the book with a soft rustle, and invited him to sit. Their conversation was awkward at first. He had never been adept at small talk, and he realized she was still a stranger. But as they spoke of the savage beauty of the North and the subtle, quiet wonders of Dorne's gardens, he realized how different their worlds were. "Sometimes the wind in Dorne carries the scent of spices from the markets," she said, her voice low, "or jasmine from the water gardens. Clings to you so you can't forget how alive the air can be. Here, I smell pine and smoke, and it is strange, but I could learn to love it." Jon tried to imagine that. He had never been to Dorne, had never ventured farther south than King's Landing during his time with the Watch. He thought of the swirling sands, the blazing sun, the bright dyes of Dornish clothing. So alien. Yet her mention of jasmine had given him a sudden pang, reminding him of the words from the old stories, how the Targaryens had once taken Dornish paramours, forging alliances. Perhaps they were forging a new story now. Weeks passed, and the unstoppable press of politics shaped their fate. One night, after meeting with the assembled lords, Jon stood with Tyene before the weirwood in the godswood of Winterfell. Snow had piled around the heart tree, and the red leaves seemed to shimmer in the torchlight. The world felt hushed, the swirl of wind like distant whispers of old gods. Here, Jon had prayed many times, seeking guidance from half-remembered deities. Tyene had asked to see the heart tree, curious about northern customs. She regarded the carved face in the trunk with thoughtful eyes. Then, quietly, she turned to Jon. "If I become part of the North," she said, "I would like to understand it as well as I can." Jon nodded. The truth was, he was only half sure of anything anymore, his birth, his place, the shape of his fate. But he could at least share what little he knew about the old gods, how the people of the North honored them in places like this. As he spoke in low tones, explaining the silent prayers, Tyene listened with a solemnity that surprised him. When he finished, she said, "In Dorne, we worship the seven for the most part, but we have our own ways. My father believed in justice and passion more than any formal gods. But I would pray here, if I may." She stepped forward and pressed her hand lightly against the trunk, where the carved face shed red sap tears. She closed her eyes, and for a moment, Jon watched her, aware of the hush, aware of how different this union was shaping to be. He saw something in her that felt genuine, a willingness to learn, to adapt. He wondered if he, in turn, could learn to adapt to her world. Within the month, a formal announcement was made to the northern lords that Jon Snow, king in the north, and Tyen Sand, representing the will of Dorne, were to be betrothed. The grumblings were many, but the most pragmatic among them, like Lord Manderley, recognized that an alliance with Dorne would provide food, gold, and a measure of southern influence that might shield the north from Lannister retaliation. Lady Mormont did not hide her reluctance, but she gave her blessing in the name of the old gods, for none could deny that they needed more swords to the cause. And the cause was not only the North's independence, but also the war against the undead threat in the far north. Tyene showed no outward sign of fear as the day of the wedding approached. She took to wearing thicker furs, pale grays and whites that contrasted with her dark hair and sun-bronzed skin. Sometimes, as she moved through the corridors, people would stop to stare. The sand snake in the cold, they whispered, the viper in Winterfell. But Tyene never rose to the bait. Instead, she continued to charm with subtle wit, the way she trained with a short dagger in the courtyard, winning the admiration of some of the younger soldiers. She had skill, that much was clear, and rumor said she knew poisons better than any maester knew cures. Sansa oversaw the wedding preparations with her usual blend of calm attention to detail. The ceremony would be in the godswood, for Jon would not pledge his vows before the seven. Tyene agreed, acknowledging the significance of the old gods to the north. The day came beneath a sky of flurries, though the worst of the winds held off until evening. Jon stood by the heart tree, clad in the black and gray of House Stark, cloak pinned by the direwolf sigil. Tyene approached, her gown a graceful mixture of northern fabrics and Dornish touches, bright embroidery on the cuffs and neckline that evoked the sun and spear of House Martell. In her hair, a small net of silver caught the torchlight, and her face was solemn, almost unreadable, as she stepped forward. The words of the marriage vow echoed among the silent watchers. Only family and close bannermen bore witness. Sansa stood to one side, her head bowed. Davos was near, along with the largest crowd of lords and ladies Winterfell had seen in months. Beyond them, the troops of Dorne and the North stood in respectful quiet. Snow crunched under Tyene's fur-lined boots as she joined Jon before the heart tree. He took her hands, as was the custom, and repeated the vow to bind their houses. His voice did not waver, though internally he fought the swirl of conflicting emotions. He was marrying a woman he hardly knew, for the good of the realm, for the cause he believed in. But there was something in her eyes, a spark of determination, perhaps even respect, that made him feel he was not alone in this vow. After the words, they sealed the union with a kiss as tradition demanded. Her lips were warm despite the cold, and the watchers erupted in a cheer that rolled like thunder through the snow-laden trees. Jon felt a sudden flush of heat in his chest, a mixture of nerves, relief, and something else he could not name. The alliance was forged. The vow was complete. Tyen Sand was now, if not in name then at least in recognition, the queen consort in the north. A modest feast followed in the great hall, though smaller than what might have been in times of plenty. Winter was upon them, and rations had to be managed carefully. Still, there was ale and mead and good hot stew, roast meats and bread. The atmosphere was cautious but not unfriendly. Even the more dour lords like Glover tried to be cordial to the new bride. She charmed them with a few stories of her father's travels, how Oberyn had once visited the north long ago and found it more to his liking than King's Landing. Whether that was truth or flourish, few could say, but it made for good conversation. Over the following weeks, Dorne formally pledged to send supplies up the neck. Wagons laden with citrus fruits, olives, fine wines, and grain began to make their slow journey north. In exchange, the North agreed to provide troops, or at least the promise of them, in the event that King's Landing turned its wrath upon the Desert Kingdom. The new alliance did not go unnoticed. Ravens from the capital began to arrive, expressing outrage and thinly veiled threats. Queen Cersei, who clung to power in the Red Keep, would not tolerate what she saw as a rebellion from the north and a betrayal from Dorne. At the same time, rumors swirled of a Targaryen queen across the sea, preparing her own invasion. The realm was fracturing, and alliances were the currency of survival. But for Jon and Tyene, each day became a delicate dance of learning how to live side by side. They did not spend their nights in the library simply talking, nor did they share every meal. The marriage was, after all, as much about politics as personal companionship. Yet they found small moments that drew them closer. Tyene took an interest in the training of the northern men, occasionally offering pointers on the use of a short spear or dagger. The men were initially skeptical, but her skill won her some reluctant admiration. When she practiced in the courtyard, her form was precise and lethal, reminiscent of Oberyn's famed style. Jon, who often sparred with the soldiers to keep his skills honed, joined her in a bout of practice one afternoon. A ring of watchers formed around them, half expecting the king in the north to thrash the southern woman in short order. Instead, the watchers were rewarded with a spectacle of feints and graceful lunges. Tyene moved like a snake indeed, weaving past Jon's overhead strikes, forcing him to use every bit of skill to keep pace. Snow kicked up around their boots, their breaths misting in the cold air as wooden blades cracked against each other. In the end, Jon won by virtue of size and stamina, disarming her with a twist that pinned her practiced blade under his own. She flashed him a grin, unoffended. "A fair match," she murmured, stepping back as the watchers gave a short cheer. The grin she wore then sent a murmur through those assembled, a mixture of grudging acceptance and genuine wonder. Later that night, Jon nursed a few fresh bruises, courtesy of Tyene's agile attacks, by the hearth in their shared chambers. Their bedding arrangement had begun awkwardly, though necessity forced them together. Tyene's presence was warm, a stark contrast to the chill that seemed to emanate from the stone walls. She said little about the unspoken demands of marriage, but she did not shy away from sharing the bed. Eventually, conversation flowed more naturally between them in those quiet hours. She told him stories of her childhood in Sunspear, of Oberyn's travels across the narrow sea, of the water gardens where she and her sisters learned to swim and run under the blazing sun. Jon, in turn, told her of growing up a bastard in Winterfell's halls, never truly belonging, always on the margins. He omitted certain details, such as his parentage, whispered to him by those who suspected his Targaryen blood, but in time he suspected that truth might come out. For now, it was enough to speak of the father he knew, Ned Stark, and the siblings who had shaped him. They found a strange sort of solidarity, both being bastards in the eyes of the world. Months passed, and the stark realities of the new alliance set in. King's Landing spat out demands that Jon bend the knee to the Iron Throne or face the consequences. Soldiers from Dorne, braving the cold in heavier cloaks than they had ever worn before, arrived in numbers not seen in the north for generations. They joined with the northern hosts at Winterfell, training together under the watchful eyes of their captains. The men eyed each other warily at first. Southern knights and spearmen, northern archers and swordsmen. But soon they realized they were bound by the marriage of their leaders and by the common threat of the Lannisters, and perhaps something even darker stirring in the far north. Jon held councils with Tyene at his side. She listened intently but never hesitated to offer her own counsel. Though she was not the eldest sand snake, her sisters were rumored to be more ruthless. She was no stranger to cunning. She had watched Oberyn's dealings in the fighting pits of Essos and the noble courts of Dorne. She understood that war was not only about swords and spears, but also about symbols and alliances. The northern lords were slow to accept her presence at the council table, but Davos always made a point of inviting her opinion, and Sansa frequently found ways to emphasize Tyene's knowledge of the southern courts. Eventually, even the most obstinate of the lords found themselves asking Tyene questions. What moves might the Lannisters make next? What banners would remain loyal to them, and which might be swayed? She would answer carefully, sometimes with a hint of a wry smile, reminding them that in the Game of Thrones, few things were certain. Beyond these mundane concerns, a far greater threat loomed: the White Walkers. Jon refused to let the matter drop from their councils. He repeatedly insisted that every man, north and south, had to be prepared to face the undead. He showed the Dornish knights the dragonglass weapons he had retrieved from Dragonstone. He explained how only fire and dragonglass could truly stop the Whites. Some of the southern men scoffed, unable to believe in a fairy tale. But Tyene quietly urged them to listen. "I have seen wonders in Essos," she told them, "and I have heard stories from men who do not lie easily. If the king in the north says this threat is real, we would do well to prepare." Despite these dire concerns, life at Winterfell took on a new rhythm. The presence of so many Dornish brightened the ancient castle in small ways. Fabrics of vivid oranges and yellows draped over tables, laughter from men who had never seen snow before. Tyene adapted as well, forging friendships with those willing to accept her. She bonded with Sansa, the two exchanging stories of survival in the face of great personal cost. She spoke politely with Arya when the girl returned from her own travels, though Arya's wolfish stare was ever watchful. Slowly, a sense of an emerging new house, Stark and Martell, made itself felt. Then came the news that King's Landing had decided to move against them, or so the rumors said. Ships were being outfitted, armies gathering. The Lannisters might be mustering a force to retake the rebellious north or punish Dorne for its betrayal. Jon's council scrambled to confirm the truth. Some suggested a preemptive strike south. Others argued that they should remain behind their defenses. Jon grappled with the burden, not wishing to lead the north into another war, but also knowing the Lannisters would not rest until they forced submission. The ravens flew, calling upon bannermen to stand ready. The war horns were dusted off, and the forges hammered out new steel. In that uncertain time, Tyene's presence offered Jon some degree of steadiness. She did not press him to launch a hasty offensive. Instead, she reminded him that the Lannisters had overreached before, and patience could be a more potent weapon than any blade. She told him the story of how her father, Oberyn, had waited years to avenge his sister's murder, biding his time until the right moment. "He found his moment in the trial by combat," she said softly, her gaze distant. "It cost him his life, but he struck a blow that still weakens the Lannisters. We must be more cautious, but also bold when the moment demands." Their private moments had become more comfortable. Though it was a political marriage, affection had begun to grow between them, a quiet understanding built on late-night talks and the shared burdens of leadership. Their wedding night had been awkward, overshadowed by the tension of duty, but in the weeks since, they had discovered a gentler warmth that blossomed slowly. Jon was not one for flowery speeches, and Tyene was not one for naive romance. Yet a mutual respect gave root to a subtle tenderness. They came to rely on each other in small ways, her hand on his shoulder when the council's arguments grew heated, his quiet reassurance when news from Dorne unsettled her. Meanwhile, Ravens arrived from the south with missives that jolted the entire realm. The Targaryen forces had landed on Dragonstone, with dragons rumored to be circling the skies. Daenerys Targaryen sought alliances with all who opposed the Lannisters. Jon, uncertain of his own Targaryen heritage at that point, debated sending an emissary. Tyene urged caution. House Martell had suffered under the dragons in ages past but had also allied with them more than once. The question was whether Daenerys would accept the North and Dorne as allies or demand fealty. At length, Jon resolved to travel south to meet this dragon queen, but not alone. He would bring Tyene for her counsel and to present a united front. Though the threat of the White Walkers weighed heavily on him, he understood that forging unity among the living was paramount. Winterfell was left in Sansa's capable hands, with Davos and a loyal guard. Snow lay thick upon the roads, but the king in the north and his Dornish queen set forth with their retinue, determined to treat with the mother of dragons. Their journey was long and fraught, with the cold hampering every day's progress once they moved beyond the neck. The Dornish guards, unused to such unrelenting winter, shivered even in their thickest furs. But Tyene rode at Jon's side, her dark curls hidden under a hood trimmed with white fox fur. Sometimes, she would glance at him and offer a small smile, a flicker of warmth in an otherwise bleak landscape. As they neared the southern lands, the climate warmed marginally. They could switch to horses better suited to southern roads. By the time they approached the Stormlands, the grass was visible, though the skies were gray with winter clouds. The strongholds they passed through offered them courtesy, more out of wariness than devotion. Everyone in the realm had heard of Jon Snow, the bastard of Winterfell who was now king in the north, and of his Dornish queen. Their first stop of significance was Storm's End, where Gendry Baratheon, acknowledged by some as the last of Robert's blood, tentatively welcomed them. He had no love for the Lannisters who had slaughtered so many of Robert's kin. In him, Jon found a potential ally, though Gendry remained uncertain about bending to a Targaryen. Over cups of ale, Tyene observed Gendry's bearing and decided he could be persuaded to join a united front if he saw a real chance at justice for the realm. Finally, they arrived at Dragonstone. The castle jutted from the sea like a dark Talon, the surging waves below crashing against ancient black rocks. The approach was guarded by soldiers bearing the three-headed dragon sigil, the Targaryen banners flapping in the salty wind. Jon felt a twist of anxiety in his gut. This place was rumored to hold secrets of the old Valyrian ways, and the Targaryens had once ruled the Seven Kingdoms with fire and blood. He wondered if Daenerys, rumored to be a breaker of chains, would live up to her own legend. They were received with guarded courtesy by Missandei of Noth and Grey Worm, who led them through the imposing gates. Tyrion Lannister was there as well, standing with measured calm, though Jon could see the flicker in his mismatched eyes. Tyrion greeted Jon with a polite bow, reminiscent of when they had first met at the Wall. Then his gaze turned to Tyene, whose features tightened at the sight of a Lannister, though she hid it behind a mask of civility. Tyrion made a sardonic quip about how interesting it was that the king in the north had chosen to ally with Dorne. "The world has changed," Jon said quietly, by way of explanation. They were led to Daenerys Targaryen's great hall. There, upon a raised seat of carved stone shaped like swirling dragons, sat the silver-haired queen who had crossed the narrow sea with Dothraki hordes and unsullied legions. She rose as they entered, flanked by loyal guards. Her hair was braided in a regal style, and a cloak of black and red draped around her shoulders. Jon bowed. Tyene offered a respectful inclination of her head, though her posture remained confident. Daenerys's gaze flicked from Jon to Tyene, curiosity lighting in her violet eyes. "I welcome you to Dragonstone," she said, her voice echoing in the cavernous chamber. "Jon Snow, king in the north, and Tyen Sand, Dornish, yes." Tyene stepped forward. "Your Grace, I come as consort to the king in the north, but also as a voice for Dorne. We would hear your intentions, and whether we share a common purpose." A small tension rippled through the room. Jon was reminded that the Martells and Targaryens had a complex history. Elia Martell had once been a Targaryen princess by marriage, brutally slain in the sack of King's Landing. Oberyn Martell had died seeking vengeance against the very Lannisters who had ended Elaya's life. Now, Daenerys Targaryen stood as the last of that line, or so many believed, and she must know the significance of Tyene's presence. Daenerys's gaze lingered on Tyene for a moment, then returned to Jon. "I know of the threats that face us," she said. "I invited you here to discuss an alliance, for the Iron Throne belongs to House Targaryen by right. The Lannisters have usurped and sullied it. But I am also told there is a greater threat beyond the wall. The dead, you say, march upon the living." Jon squared his shoulders. "Yes, all petty politics will be moot if we do not unite. The army of the dead is real, led by the Night King, and we will need every army in the Seven Kingdoms if we're to stand a chance. That's why I've allied with Dorne, and that's why I'm here, to seek your help." Daenerys listened, her expression neutral, though Tyrion's features showed a flicker of concern. Then the Queen said, "I will help you if you will bend the knee. Swear fealty to me as the rightful Queen of the Seven Kingdoms, and I will join my forces with yours to defeat this threat." Tyene tensed. She had seen the devouring ambition of would-be monarchs before. She glanced at Jon, who remained calm. He had expected as much, but the North was never eager to bend the knee to another southern ruler, no matter how noble the cause. They stood at a crossroads with the fate of their alliance in question. Over the next days, negotiations were tense. Daenerys insisted that unity required acknowledging her claim to the throne. Jon insisted that the threat of the Night King could not wait for elaborate shows of homage. Tyene added that the Martells had their own claim to consider. Elia had been a Targaryen princess, and the horrors inflicted upon her had never been atoned for. Yet she did not press for vengeance now. She pressed for recognition that Dorne was an equal partner, not a lesser kingdom to be commanded. Tyrion and Varys served as mediators, offering logic and caution. Missandei spoke of Daenerys' mission to break the wheel of tyranny. Slowly, the talk shifted from demands to possible concessions. During one private conversation in a torchlit corridor, Daenerys confronted Jon and Tyene together. She looked at Jon, her expression thoughtful. "You say you saw the Night King. You fought his whites. You risk everything to save your people. That suggests a true king to me. Yet I have come too far to be another petty lord's ally. My armies are vast, my dragons formidable. Why should I risk them for the North if the North will not stand by me afterwards?" Jon hesitated, searching for words. Tyene answered, "Because the war against the dead will spare no one, not even you and your dragons, if it is lost. Because the North and Dorne together can be powerful allies in your struggle to reclaim the Iron Throne. We ask for respect, not subjugation." Daenerys studied her. "And if I demanded you both bend the knee, as was done in ages past when Aegon conquered the Seven Kingdoms?" Tyene inclined her head with surprising calm. "Dorne was never truly conquered. History teaches that. My father's ancestors drove the dragons away at a great cost. Yes, but we endured. Now you ask us to bend. Some in Dorne might consider it if you show them why it is necessary and just. We are not an unreasonable people, but we also do not forget how the realm has treated us. The Lannisters have done us grievous harm, and the Targaryens were the cause of Elaya's marriage in the first place. We seek an alliance of equals, not a repetition of old power plays." Daenerys considered these words carefully. For the first time, Jon saw a flicker of uncertainty behind her regal facade. Perhaps she realized that forging alliances with entrenched powers required more than the threat of dragons. Perhaps she also recognized that Jon and Tyene were forging a new path. Two bastards, shaped by adversity, leading realms that had once been overshadowed by the might of the Iron Throne. A compromise began to form. The North would acknowledge Daenerys as the rightful queen of the Seven Kingdoms, but with the understanding that, until the threat of the Night King was dealt with, the North would maintain its autonomy to rally forces against the undead. Dorne, as an ally of the North, would also be recognized for its unique status. No forced kneeling, but an alliance treaty that ensured mutual protection. Daenerys would pledge the might of her dragons and armies against the White Walkers and the Lannisters. Once the war was over, the question of how the realm would be governed could be revisited, with input from the north, Dorne, and any other regions that stood by Daenerys. It was an uneasy peace, but it was enough for a start. Daenerys, Jon, and Tyene stood upon the cliffs of Dragonstone, watching the roiling sea beneath a cloudy sky. A chill wind blew from the north, carrying the promise of winter even to this southern isle. Drogon, the largest of Daenerys's dragons, swooped overhead, casting a massive shadow across the surf. Jon felt awe at the creature's power, and Tyene's eyes shone with something akin to wonder. The War Council was called. They discussed strategy, how Daenerys's forces might strike at King's Landing while also preparing to send aid north. Jon urged them to gather dragonglass, stockpile it in Winterfell, and arm as many men as possible. Tyene pressed for caution in dealing with King's Landing, pointing out that the Lannisters still had an extensive spy network. Tyrion offered plans for a swift blow to the capital to end Cersei's reign, but they had to weigh the possibility that such a move would leave them vulnerable to the undead. At night, in the chambers given to them at Dragonstone, Jon and Tyene conferred in hushed voices. She recounted the day's negotiations, analyzing Tyrion's every statement. Jon admitted he was unsure if Daenerys could be trusted fully, but they had little choice. 3 dragons might well turn the tide against the White Walkers. Tyene slid her hand into his, a small gesture of reassurance. They had come far together since that first uncertain night in Winterfell. She had learned the shape of his scars, the lines of his face when he frowned, the slow burn of his rare smiles. And in turn, he had begun to see beneath her poised exterior, glimpsing her quiet fear that the realm might never heal, that Dorne would forever be seen as an outlier. When at last they returned to Winterfell, they did so with new allies in tow. A portion of Daenerys's Unsullied and Dothraki rode north, accompanied by dragons who circled overhead from time to time, causing panic among the small folk. The journey was arduous, the weather ruthless, but the massive host pressed on. The armies of House Martell, what remained of them under the new leadership that had thrown in its lot with Tyene, followed, forging a caravan that stretched as far as the eye could see. Winterfell bustled like never before. Troops from Dorne huddled around roaring fires. Dothraki riders studied the snowy ramparts with wide-eyed wonder. Unsullied formed disciplined lines, unaffected by the cold. And overshadowing it all was the knowledge that the wall might soon be tested as never before. Jon and Tyene resumed their roles as the core of the Stark-Dornish alliance. The northern lords who once doubted her now saw the columns of supplies from Dorne, the cavalry that might help them stand against the Lannisters, and they began to nod in approval. Meanwhile, the White Walkers drew ever closer. Scouts reported whites roaming the far edges of the haunted forest. The Vale men under Lord Royce arrived, bolstering Winterfell's defenses further. Rumors spread that even the Iron Islands were in chaos, their fleets divided between those loyal to the crown and those who sought their own gain. And in King's Landing, Cersei fumed, plotting an unimaginable retribution for the treasonous North and scheming Dorne. Amid these tensions, Jon called a great war council in the Great Hall. Daenerys Targaryen was present, as were her principal advisors, Tyrion, Varys, Grey Worm, Missandei. Tyene sat to Jon's right, Sansa to his left. The northern lords filled the benches, along with representatives from Dorne and the Vale. They discussed how best to face the armies of the dead, whether to attempt a last stand at the wall or to lure the Night King south to Winterfell. Tyrion proposed capturing a white to prove the threat to other potential allies. Tyene cautioned that such a plan might be more dangerous than beneficial. Sansa worried about trusting Cersei's word if they invited her to a truce. Through it all, Jon remained steadfast, determined to unite every force he could muster. Tyene's hand sometimes found his beneath the table, a private gesture of solidarity, as the council erupted into arguments. They had come together from across the realm to stand against extinction. This was the alliance Tyene's father might have dreamed of, Dorne and the North, with the Targaryen heir forging a realm that might be free of Lannister tyranny. In the following weeks, scouts brought dire news. The wall had been breached. The Night King had a dragon of his own, a horrifying white with icy blue flames. Eastwatch by the Sea had fallen, and the undead poured through. The final war for the living had begun. Jon ordered all forces to concentrate at Winterfell. Men, women, and even children who could fight took up arms. The forges of Winterfell blazed day and night, hammering out dragonglass arrows, spears, and blades. Daenerys's dragons were readied, though the threat of an undead dragon weighed heavily on her mind. When the army of the dead finally appeared on the horizon, it was a chilling sight. An endless tide of whites, swirling snow, and the towering figures of White Walkers astride dead horses. The defenders of Winterfell, from Dornish spearmen to northern archers, from Dothraki screamers to unsullied phalanxes, lined the battlements and the fields beyond. Jon stood at the front with Ghost at his side, the direwolf's red eyes fixed on the approaching horrors. Daenerys soared overhead on Drogon, regal following. Tyene took a position with the Dornish cavalry, a short spear in her hand, her face set in grim determination. She wore a white cloak embroidered with the Martell sun, symbolizing the unity of Dorne and the North against this otherworldly threat. The battle that ensued was beyond anything the living had ever faced. Whites surged forward in a relentless wave, clashing against unsullied shields, scrabbling up siege ladders, forcing the defenders to fight tooth and nail. The dragons unleashed torrents of fire, incinerating ranks of the dead. But the Night King's presence corrupted the sky, swirling snow and wind in an unholy blizzard. His undead dragon spewed cold blue flames that clashed with Drogon's fire in a furious aerial duel. The clash of swords, the screams of men, the shrieks of whites filled the night. Jon found himself in the thick of the fight, Longclaw cleaving through rotted flesh and brittle bone. Each time a White Walker appeared, the living struggled to bring it down with dragonsteel or fire. Tyene rode with a column of Dornish cavalry, skewering whites with her spear. She led her men with a fierce cry, reminiscent of her father's panache for battle. Together, they made strategic strikes where the lines faltered. Even as the dead threatened to encircle them, she and her riders fought with a fluid grace. More than once, Jon saw her fling a small blade coated with some glistening substance, perhaps a poison that worked even on the undead, slowing their onslaught. The night raged on, a horror show of swirling snow and death. Many fell on both sides. Daenerys barely escaped the Night King's icy spear, losing Regal in the chaos. But in a critical moment, as the Night King advanced upon Jon in the courtyard, determined to snuff out the king in the north, Tyene appeared at Jon's side, hurling a spear of dragonglass. It shattered against the White Walker nearest the Night King, dissolving it in a burst of ice shards. Jon, freed from the lesser foe, charged forward with Longclaw. A swirl of ephemeral shadows parted. The Night King raised his hand in a silent, mocking challenge. In the end, it was Arya who dealt the fatal blow, leaping from the shadows with a dragonglass dagger. The Night King shattered, and with him, the entire army of whites collapsed into lifeless heaps of ice and bone. An otherworldly shriek echoed across the battlefield. Then, an uncanny silence. Dawn found the survivors blinking in the pale light, surrounded by the remains of an apocalyptic conflict. Winterfell had endured, but at a terrible cost. The North and Dorne had stood together. Daenerys' forces, unsullied, Dothraki, and the remaining dragons, had proven their might. And now the living could turn their gaze south to the Lannisters. But that was a question for another day. In that moment, in the smoking ruins of Winterfell's fields, Jon and Tyene found each other amid the chaos. Exhausted, battered, they embraced, the relief of survival coursing through them like the first warming rays of spring. For a moment, neither needed to speak. The memory of battle lingered in their eyes. They had fought side by side, not as strangers bound by politics, but as partners facing a shared doom. And they had triumphed. In the days that followed, they counted the dead, honored the heroes, and began the long process of rebuilding. Daenerys prepared to press her claim against the Lannisters, now that the threat from the north was ended. Jon and Tyene watched as the battered but unbroken forces of Dorne and the north gathered themselves for the next challenge. The nightmares of winter's darkest threat had been banished, at least for now. In the courtyard of Winterfell, amidst the drifting snow and the broken weapons strewn across the ground, Jon stood with Tyene, gazing at the banners, direwolf, dragon, and sun and spear, flapping in a cold breeze. He reached for her hand. She gave it willingly. They had united their houses in an unlikely match, a stark Dornish alliance that had once seemed an impossible dream. The realm might still be torn by war, but they had proven that even the most distant kingdoms could stand together against a common enemy. As the sun's pale light glimmered over Winterfell's walls, Jon glanced down at Tyene's face. Though she looked weary, a quiet resolve burned in her eyes. They had survived the dead. Next, they would face the living, and they would do so together. The new queen consort in the north and the king in the north would march south, forging a future that might finally break the cycle of blood and vengeance that had plagued the Seven Kingdoms for generations. Beneath the watching gaze of the ancient weirwood, beneath the swirling snow, a single question hung in the air. Would their alliance, their union, their hard-won bond of the North and Dorne, be strong enough to stand against the final writhing of the dying order in King's Landing? None could say for certain, but Jon Snow and Tyen Sand had dared to dream of a realm not ruled by fear, but by unity born of the harshest battles fought side by side. And in that dream, the seeds of a new age were planted, fertilized by courage and watered by the tears of the living. They had weathered the winter's darkest night. Spring might yet come,